All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of our EDI, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Decolonization Week. Today's presentation is Eliminating Racial Discrimination in Public Institutions of Higher Education. Also, I just want to note that we are here to continue the work of uplifting efforts in challenging oppression, as well as acknowledging the ongoing and future work required to build a more just campus, community, and world. EDID Week 2023 began yesterday, and events will run all week long. So for tomorrow, for those of you that are following us for the remainder of the week, you will discover collaboration. So there will be a Kahoot session from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. in the CAW Student Center, an alumni auditorium, a trivia competition with the theme of the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent, presented by Caitlin Ellsworth, UWindsor's Black Student Support Coordinator, and Linda Nguyen, Lancer Leadership Ambassador and Outstanding Scholar. You will discover collaboration as a virtual lecture on monitoring the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples from 11 a.m. to noon, presented by Dr. Beverly Jacobs, Senior Advisor to the President of Indigenous Relations and Outreach. As well, there will be a student panel, virtual discussion on the Muslim experience at UWindsor from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m., facilitated by Fatima Faki, sessional instructor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Windsor. To register for these events and more, please visit uwindsor.ca/VPEDI. Before we begin, I would like to offer our land acknowledgement. The University of Windsor is built on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and Potawatomi. The land was stolen from indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans were brought en masse to build these cities. This is occupied indigenous territories and of many nations, and these cities are built with stolen African labor and resources. One cannot be remembered without the other. We invite you into a tradition with us of acknowledging and remembering whose territory you are on wherever you are in the Americas, from the North to the Caribbean and to the South, and also remembering and acknowledging that it was built with stolen African and Black labor resources as well. So for tonight, eliminating racial discrimination in public institutions of higher education. To our streaming audience, if you have questions at the end of our presentation, please refer to the Q&A icon at the top of your screen and include your question in the Q&A box. To our live audience here today, we welcome you and we welcome your questions at the end of the presentation. Today, our presenter is Dr. Natalie Delia Deckard. Natalie Delia Deckard did her BA in Latin American Studies at Columbia University, her MA in Sociology at the University of South Florida, and her PhD in Sociology at Emory University. She is a critical criminologist working from the paradigms of critical race theory. While seeking to deconstruct racialization as a social process, she interrogates the criminalizing process through which North Americans collectively imagine the non-white other. By investigating the inherent criminality of the racialized body and the ways in which the designation is complicated by migrant identity, she is able to speak to questions of identity, conflict, violence, and the construction of the racial and ethnic other. By employing this perspective, she is able to critically engage with questions of gender, class, and their meaning in the larger political economy. She speaks internationally on racism and anti-racism, published widely, and sits on the editorial board of the Sociology of Race and Ethnicity. Ladies and gentlemen, guests, please welcome Dr. Natalie Delia Deckard.
Thank you so much, Miriam. I love listening to biographies that are written by others about me. They're always so much kinder than the ones that I provide. Welcome everyone in real life. Welcome those of us who are streaming. Thank you all for coming. I know we are so overprogrammed. I don't just mean professionally, I don't just mean personally, I mean all of it in 2023. The fact that you've taken an hour and a half, right, and then maybe time after that, right, to engage with this conversation, to think through what anti-racism means as a mandate and why discrimination is unacceptable in a liberal democracy isn't lost on me. Thank you. I very intentionally entitled this talk in the most clickbaity manner possible. It doesn't say mitigating, it doesn't say lessening, it doesn't say making better, it says eliminating. Because go big or go home. We have the capacity to exist in better institutions, and we have that mandate, not just for our students, not just for faculty members, but for the entire community. And indeed, I'm going to make the argument, feedback loop. Indeed, I'm going to make the argument for the nation as a whole. We have the capacity to recognize the ways in which race is a social construction, and that means that it is changeable. Racism is crucial to the mandate of constructing race. Why are we creating categories and hierarchies, if not to discriminate based on them? What are the ways in which we can critically interrogate race, racism, and discrimination? And indeed, why is it our mandate? I presumed to make an agenda, mostly to keep me on track. I want to go through not just race and racism, but how we can change and how we can eliminate it. Simply what we know from the existing literature to be true, and the ways in which we can incorporate that into our practice at universities to be a catalyst for a better society, as opposed to a site of the replication of stigma and discrimination. And then I think I put on the agenda Q&A at the end, but if I didn't, there's definitely Q&A. I want this to be an open discussion. I think it's important that I put together the draft of this slide deck while I was watching women talking. I don't want to get bogged down in what I consider to be the ugly. I don't think that I speak only for myself, and I'm looking around the room when I say, I am so tired. I'm tired of fighting the atrocity, of fighting the indignity, of fighting the bad. And rather, I want to take the opportunity to question, who is it that we want to be? What is good? What is moral? What is ethical? What is beautiful? And then I was perhaps overly fixated on the idea of beauty, right? And I decided to have beautiful slides. They're super floral, I love them. I put here an imaginary quote. Right? What's the point of any of it? Asked the nihilist of the cynic. I want to engage each of you with the complete lack of utility in that question. If you are not doing what you can, when you can, 100% of the time, without delay, and justifying that inaction, and indeed that cowardice in, well, what can I really do anyway? No, that is not our mandate. That's not moral. When we talk, right, about EDID week in general, I want to very clearly engage with race in terms of the literal and the metaphor. Okay. I said that race is a social construction. I want to go through that. But understand that all axes of oppression, all lines of power and disempowerment are connected, and they're part of a larger social system. I'm focusing today on race as one axis of oppression, but I want you to hear what I'm saying about power and its abuse. That's what I'm hoping to cover in my talk today. A good friend of mine once said that all slides of this sort should be called me, 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 me. She's not wrong. That's solid. Miriam gave me an excellent introduction. These are all my credentials. It's what makes me legitimate, right, to a diverse audience in an academic setting. Okay. Also, hey, my name's Natalie. I've been around a minute. I've been in this particular body for a minute. I've existed in the global north, sometimes in the global south. Okay. I have to acknowledge that while the statistics say that I make 57 cents for every dollar made by a white man, there are also 100 women no better, no worse than me, working twice as hard than me, twice as hard as me in the global south, and struggling to feed their children. I'm both disadvantaged and deeply privileged. How do we act authentically knowing that? I do not want to give a presentation where I talk about we the oppressed. That's not true. Also, I don't want to give a presentation speaking to other people's privileges, other people's incapacity to see, other people's unwillingness to grapple with the realities of disadvantage without acknowledging my own. I speak for everyone in this room, both virtual and in real life, when saying this. Right now I'm speaking English. Y'all understand me. That means that we can read 70% of the academic publications, that is knowledge, published in this world without trouble. What a privilege. That means I could go on. Point. I say with confidence that we all exist somewhere on a spectrum of disadvantage and privilege. And to pretend that that is not true or that it's a problem of other people is intellectually dishonest. I was born in Queens. I have US papers. That means that millions of people have been killed to afford me privilege. I didn't choose that. It's not my fault. But why are we talking about me instead of the millions of people? What a distraction. Who cares how I feel about it? It's just there. To gaslight, to pretend when I'm in Latin America that the choices that my grandparents made to make my life easier weren't at the expense of people who look just like me, who have the same socio-political history, is to make worse that violence. I am a cisgendered woman. So, fight the patriarchy. Also, what are the ways in which I say things like, my husband said, in order to legitimate me as an authority, I'm chosen? How deeply heterosexist. What are the ways that I leverage relative privilege or choose not to leverage relative privilege in the face of apparent disadvantage? Who am I putting down to keep myself up? I hope that we're all on a journey to do less of that instead of on a journey to prove that you don't have the right to question me, which is behavior that I see a lot and is not reflective of our best selves. I want to tell a story that positions me in this context. I say it as an actual story that happened. Also, those of you that know me know I love a good parable. My former student chuckles, it's true. I love a good parable. The summer that I turned 18, me and, we'll call him my boyfriend, that's fine, rented a small apartment on the coast of Spain. South Coast, it was like $350 a month. It really wasn't that big a deal. Also, I was living my best life. It was awesome. Okay. We had been out, we were going to meet friends who were arriving from the train station, coming from Madrid. The train arrived at about midnight. So we were well on our night. So we decided we're going to walk from the bars to the train station to pick them up. This is before cell phones, so if you're not there, you could conceivably never see these people again. And as we're walking, it's a resort town. It's late. Lots of music, lots of dancing on the street, lots of people. Like you're navigating right through people, through the crowd. It's a dynamic, moving thing. And I'm from New York originally. I sense hubbub before you can even see hubbub. I have that literacy. Something's about to go down. And there is a young woman, she's being carried by 6 young men. She's fighting. And she is screaming and she is yelling, and I don't understand what she's saying. I still don't know what language she was speaking. I'm going to say that no one on the street understood what she was saying, but I don't 100% know that because I didn't do a poll. But one of the young men that was carrying her was saying in Spanish, which people understand, "Está borracha, la está llevando a casa." She's drunk. We're taking her home. Y'all, that's not what was happening. But I didn't understand what she was saying. And I did understand what he was saying. And if I believed him, I could continue on my way to the station and meet Ernestina and Mateo and go about our night. And no one was doing anything. No one was saying anything. No one was stopping anything. And let me be clear, when you're 18.1 years old, you are not the most competent person in the street scene. What is 911 in Spain? I don't have a cell phone anyway. It shouldn't have fallen to me, but it did fall to me because no one else did anything. If I intervene, does that end rape culture? Does that fix sexism? Does it change the world? Does it end the problem? No. But do I have a moral obligation to say, this is deeply inconvenient for me at present? Stop. Yeah. And no amount of excuse making that we all do all the time. Every time we walk by someone, every time we continue down our news feed, every time we see it on the news and we're like, we have a moral obligation to do what we can, where we can, 100% of the time. Now, that went down in 1998. We can never go back. The point of education is to know better and to make sure that rather than always defending our actions, we live in the what is better. Me is Natalie. Me is the purveyor of parable. Me is the person that says, it wasn't on you to end human trafficking. It was just on you to be like, where do you think you're going? 100% of the time. I want to talk about race. Foucault's going to make the argument. Foucault has passed. He's not making any arguments at present. Foucauldian theory suggests that our current understanding of race comes from before this map that I randomly found when I went to images.google.com. Okay. Does anyone see Canada on this map? It's not there, don't look. Does anyone see the current world as it exists and is legible at present? No. But the current power structures that we exist in were already made. It was about have and have not. It was about who gets to be a person and who is rendered a commodity or chattel. It is about who has rights and the right to have rights, and who can be plundered, who can be dispossessed. This is about 6 generations ago. My son recently told me The Judeo-Christian tradition, what happens to you lives on to the 5th generation. I found that so interesting. Recently, they've made all kinds of strides in epigenetics. As it turns out, what happens to you lives in your body. And you pass it to your children, and then them, and then them, their children. Wow, that was regrettable. To the 5th generation, ongoing for epigenetics. Okay. This world looks a lot like this world, which should be very legible to you. Where's Canada? It's right there. It's yellow. Okay. The racial imaginations that exist as a function of time and place are bound in the power structures of nations. But y'all, borders are imaginary. But also, they're very real in their impact. I say race is a function of time and place. In Latin America, I'm Trigueña. Wheat-colored. We are all absolutely of Southern European and West African descent in some way, shape, or form. Racialization exists on a spectrum in that context. In the United States, there is a biological essential difference between the descendants of those who were enslaved on cotton plantations and those enslaved on sugar plantations. Why? Because the political distinction between the descendants of those we enslaved and those who are the descendants of those they enslaved is understood to be writ onto the body and an essential characteristic. And so we count Hispanic, Black, white. In Canada, we aspire to be part of the British Commonwealth in our sensibilities so much. Just look at the way that they spell things. So much. Like 3 people in the real audience were like, what should do with that? That's how we spell things. In the British sensibility, we have hypodescent. Writ onto the body, whether or not enslavement is a part of your epigenetic history, or whether your ancestors presumed to own. And we write this onto the body as though we're a biological reality. Don't raise your hands. A bunch of you have done the whole 23andMe thing. Oh, isn't that interesting? Isn't it curious? Biologically, what am I? Except here's the thing. What you are has different meanings in different spaces, and in all of them, it will be understood as organic, as natural, as unavoidable. But it's really just an expression of existing power hierarchies made legible for everyone. There's a whole bunch of different ways that we justify the existence of race. One, phenotypical. I know people look different. I get it. Yep, I also see the world. But to what extent are those real phenotypical differences understood as essential parts of the identity? Well, are they politically useful? Another is some understanding of culture or cultural. I was in another talk at EDID week where the panelists were talking about anti-Semitism and the racialization of Judaism as a faith. Yes, yes, especially when it's politically useful to those who are empowered. Yes. And they taught us in the 4th grade, they said, oh my gosh, how could anybody, right? Judaism is a faith. And we were 8 and we were like, oh yes, it's so silly. Come to find out that what we imagine as a society to be true becomes true in its ramifications. And here we are. Approximately 1 in 4 people of Muslim faith in the United States are African American. The literature shows that both a quantitative analysis of hate crimes and qualitative analyses in which researchers talk to people and see how they experience their lives Black Muslims in the United States get discriminated against, get crimes committed against them for their Blackness, rather than as victims of Islamophobia, because they are racialized as Black in the collective imagination. Similarly, and on the other side, the violence against Sikh communities, almost always followed by some comment, Sikhs aren't Muslim. Yes, correct, 100%. But they are racialized as racialized Muslims in the collective imagination, and so they become the victims of prejudice, discrimination, and violence, because race is a function of time and place. And it doesn't matter how imagined the socio-historical context in which your body exists is. You will experience violence as people who are relatively empowered seek to further disempower you. We justify race in all of these terms, right? Ancestry, right? What is the blood genome? Oh my God, right? Endless. But really what it comes down to is who wields power over who? And how can we narrate that? I make the argument in this talk and in general that indeed, racism is the whole point of race. Hierarchy is created. It is writ onto the body. It's not that difference is noted. And the only reason for that at the level of this society is to narrate oppression and to narrate abuse. So the question becomes, how do we eliminate racism from the university? I want to be clear. The university has power. I don't just mean the University of Windsor, although we are thought leaders in Windsor, Essex, in southwestern Ontario, and in Canada. We have our own police force. But I would tend to think that we are leaders because we train, we educate, we create knowledge, we publicize that knowledge. When the public discourse seeks to legitimate the events of the day and their interpretation, they come to faculty members, they come to the universities, as they should. Faculty members make money. It's called a salary. It's paid for in tax dollars to do this work of contextualizing, of making sense. Are we sites for the justification of exclusion? Or are we sites for the justification of equality? I want to be clear. The University of Windsor particularly has seen both sides of that coin, y'all. Famously, importantly, we have been the site of exclusion. It took me 5 seconds to find these screenshots. I told you that I'm looking for beauty. I wanted to spend as little time as possible curating this. The university is a site of education, of training, of shaping our region, and as a site of defending itself against what it did. The university is the sayer of, but I was too young, I didn't have any responsibility, but it wouldn't have fixed human trafficking anyway. But you know, I was in a rush, but you know, I didn't really have it. Gross. I want to be clear about a lot of things, right? But we have a mandate. Somebody said this to me. They were like, it's all social engineering. And I was like, yeah, indeed, absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and reclaim that. The university is about social engineering. We're supposed to train the workforce of tomorrow. We're supposed to educate the citizens of the next generation. We are supposed to speak to the needs of the region, speak to the needs of the public to be better, whatever better is. I don't care what discipline we're talking about. I don't care what faculty we're talking about. We're supposed to be helping some segment of society be better. The university is about social engineering. They pay us to do that. Education is about social engineering more broadly. When we talk about the hidden curriculum in the public boards, y'all notice that you go to like the store and you stand in line naturally and someone cuts a line and everybody like loses their minds? We learned that in kindergarten when they socially engineered it. Actually, lines are not the most equitable way of figure. We are about social engineering. Okay. To the good or to the bad. How do we eliminate racism from the university? I argue we eliminate racism from the university. In real life, like you don't talk about it endlessly, like you do the thing, like do it, do the thing. I love applause for do the thing. I pulled these. Okay. We went a different way with it recently. Okay. I'm using this as one example because it happens to be last week. Right. We have a new Black Studies Institute at the University of Windsor. Blackness matters. We count. We are legitimate. We are different, not worse. Never deficient. Never, ever, ever. Deficiency is about power. We started the Black Studies Institute, and that gave us the ability and the mandate, but I want to talk about the ability, the capacity, the resources to fight anti-Black racism in the society as a whole and force the public sphere to be better. How did those complaints get written? How did those letters get published? How did any of that happen before we had a space? Didn't really. How could it? How could it? Because you're disempowered from the beginning. And what that means is that instead of individual racialized people broadly and Black people specifically having to refight the fight from scratch by themselves with no backup, which also flies in the face of 200 years of organized labor. There is now a structure and there is now a legitimacy. The university creates that or fails to create that as an active process, as a choice. What we decided, being a little generous with decided, but what we decided was to not exist as a space for the replication of existing inequities, but rather render equitable. I want this to be part of a larger commentary on how ships get righted. How do you change your trajectory? The University of Windsor is a single example of a regional university, population approximately 20,000 between students, staff, and faculty members. It's a biggish ship. How do you change? The first thing that I want to recognize is that while I struggle with the clicker, is that the literature on this is extensive. Okay? I am actually not, there's not a single new thought on this slide. I'm just reading the news, y'all. Okay. One, how do you render racialized scholars as purveyors of knowledge rather than merely deficient learners? You resource, you create departments, you hire. You make racialized scholarship something that is taught. Like you do the thing. You don't talk about what it would look like once we were done teaching all of the realities, all of the histories, all of the ways of knowing of the dominant culture over and over again, and then being like, why don't you learn? Rather, you resource the teaching of. Two, you understand and indeed embrace a revolutionary canon. Speaking to Frey right now. You render legitimate alternate ways of knowing and of being in a truly diverse university. We are purveyors of knowledge. We are teachers. We are social engineers. We don't just do that one way. 3, advocacy. You do not, as an institution, hide from controversy. Right? Attempt to bury your head in the sand. Oh, it's too hard. Oh, it makes people uncomfortable. Oh, what could we ever do? You lean in. We were talking about labor studies, union rights. And I had a conversation with a union member and they said, I can't even imagine labor and labor paradigms being taught in the university. We learn that at the kitchen tables. You go to university to learn how people are centers of profit. And I was like, that is so powerful. So I said it, and then it was in the newspaper, and then I got my first protester because I'm a communist. Calling someone of Cuban descent a communist, like really Sherlock Holmes that. But more broadly, universities are supposed to be protested. People are supposed to get upset. And the university's response should be like the glee on my face right now, where I'm like, not, oh no. We're forcing people to think. 100% systematic advocacy paradigm. We stand for it. And last but certainly not least, what is it to lean into relational peership? I call it, on a future slide, grace. Grace. At the University of Windsor, please do not misunderstand me. I'm not arguing that we have fixed ourselves. I would never make that argument. That being said, the institution looks different than it did. That's not nothing. Okay. The Black Scholars Hiring Initiative systematically increases representation, yes, of Black scholars at the university. But we leaned in. We did not replicate the hiring system where non-Black people sit at a table and decide what they would like from Black people. And then they carefully curate an applicant pool of what they would like to see. And then they gauge applicants' Black credentials as Black people and Black scholars and Black ways of knowing. And they're like, you make me uncomfortable. And then they hire accordingly. Rather, the university said, oh my gosh, Black people are the same as other people, even white people. Why don't Black people decide what Black ways of knowing are with no oversight from white people? And why don't we build Black studies in that way? It is unique in Canada. And in its logics, it is revolutionarily, empirically anchored in best practice. We should be proud. We are proud. And it's part of it. Also, it's been really challenging, but let's go next slide. This didn't catch up. We have a disparity between the two slides. Give me 1 second. I'm going to try to. Interdisciplinary and critical studies. The university has made the commitment by Senate bylaw, not on the sides, not as an addendum, not as a PS, not as a performative activity, but as a peer, as an equal, as a seat at the table. There are other ways than these. We've resourced it. Because best practice says that if you want to fight the patriarchy, you need women in gender studies. Because it's a university. And if you want to talk about radical crip theory, you need disability studies. Because or else, it's just the pretenders at the sides. Not real knowledge producers, not real scholars, not real knowers, not real educators. People writing things. The university has taken the radical move of actually institutionalizing critical studies and housing it to the point about alternative ways of knowing is key to the anti-racist paradigm. We can see the difference already. An advocacy paradigm. Races has created an actual system of accountability that is extra institutional but works within the institution to say there needs to be advocacy. It needs to be independent, and we need to hold power holders feet to the fire in terms of fulfilling their own words and their own commitments and their own promises. From the point of view of the institution, you have two options. Right? You can either think about organizations like races as enemies, as people to be fought off. Right? Or you can say, oh yeah, we gotta do that. That's true. That's solid. To the degree that the University of Windsor has a fundamentally different understanding of what activism looks like and what it means for the institution, we've grown. When we talk about advocacy, I want to bring us back to last week and the racist treatment of one of our faculty members in a public forum at the hands of a minister of parliament. Right? Again, I could use other examples, but this just happened, so we'll do this. Okay. I got copied on no fewer than 24 emails of faculty members who are writing to their MPs, right, saying, how could this have happened? How do you allow this? Now, I agree, they should totally write those emails, absolutely, no, like 100%. But here's what's interesting. Many of those faculty members were faculty members who 2 years ago said, stop being so hostile. There's no problem. I don't understand why you're like this, Natalie. They're faculty members who I would never have described as anti-racist. But now we have a 100% advocacy paradigm, and we have an institutionalized mechanism through which to do that advocacy. And I'm going to make the argument, right, that labeling theory, the idea that if you call someone a name, they will live up to that name. Right? The idea that if someone has a reputation, right, they will enact that reputation is true. And whereas 3 years ago, we had the reputation for being a racist institution and people were living up to it, today I'm being copied on anti-racist emails by the same people that used to defend. Because we're an anti-racist institution. Just look at us. And while I'm not going to pretend to be a bigger person than I am, every single time I get copied on one of those, I'm like, More broadly, and to the point of this particular talk, it's fantastic. It's fantastic. The existing literature predicts that espousing an advocacy paradigm would help to right the ship. And the small end news from the trenches is that seems to be true. Certainly not least, now I'm struggling with the clicker. I want to talk about what I am calling, for the purposes of this talk, grace. Relational peership, if you go to scholar.google.com, it's what'll get you into this literature. But what they mean is grace. Toby Rollo wrote a piece, and he made the argument, it's not famous, but I happen to like it, so here we all are. Made the argument that all oppression is fundamentally within the umbrella of white men's burden. The oppressor never wants to be the oppressor. The power holder never wants to cop to having power and abusing it. Rather, if we understand the way that parents are supposed to discipline children, think about the way that we discipline children as a society. I'm doing this for your benefit. I'm helping you through my punishment. I'm educating you. I'm actually doing you a favor. It's 1985. This hurts you more, or this hurts me more than it hurts you. Unapproval. Toby Rollo makes the argument that fundamental to the oppressive endeavor is the infantilization of a person that should be a peer, and thus the justification of the abuse. If we look back to some imagined 1960 sexism, right, we see this paradigm, right? Men saving women from themselves. Right? You can't have your own bank account. Think about how badly that would go for you. The infantilization of the victim to justify the oppression and the exercise of power. Relational peership is the abnegation of that paradigm. It is the revolutionary idea that across diverse socio-political histories, we are all peers. And what that means is that the default cannot be, should not be, will not be. Prove it to me. Explain it to me again and again. Bleed for me. But rather, oh, cool. In literally all of the meh of what I just did. I've already placed myself as a cisgendered woman. Right? I'm also straight. The example about not legitimating myself through the use of my heteronormative, monogamous, long-term legal partnership is an example from 2 weeks ago. When one of my queer friends was like, "Did you see the thing you just did? Don't like that." And I was like, and I gotta be honest, I didn't see it in the moment. But I trust that they have thought much more about heterosexism than I have, because the thing about privilege is it's invisible. I do almost no thinking about it at all. So my default position is, oh, you must be right. And that should be my default position, because we exist in grace. The idea that the institution has to fall back on some sort of procedural regularity that starts to resemble a maximum security prison with head counts, quorum. It's the opposite of grace. And it's what happens when there's no mutual understanding, when there's no collaboration, when there's no respect. We're trying to operate from a position of grace. And in practice, honestly, it's super challenging, but it's worthwhile. My comments are absolutely now at the question and answer and discussion and what do you got? I wanted to change the slide, but my virtual and real life audience both know that I'm struggling with the clicker. What do we do now? Is an intentional question. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Is this okay? Just checking to make sure it's still. Thank you, Dr. Deckard. As everyone, we are going to open up the Q&A, but as you are formulating your questions either online, if you're doing so, please go to the tab for Q&A and post your questions for Dr. Deckard there. For those of you in the live audience, I will be going around momentarily with the microphone, and you can stand up and ask your question. Raise your hand first so we can come to you. But before we do that, and before I open up the floor for questions, I feel that in my eagerness to get to the conversation, this great conversation that we're about to have, and to Dr. Deckard's presentation, I neglected to introduce myself. So all of you don't think I'm just some random sitting here with Dr. Deckard. My name is Miriam Tolson Murty, and I'm the Director of Anti-Racism Organizational Change in the Office of the Vice President, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion at the University of Windsor. Yes, that's a long title, but that's who I am, and Natalie and I have done work and will be continuing to do a lot of great work together at the institution to implement change. So as questions are beginning to formulate in the Q&A, and we know that you have a lot of questions for Dr. Deckard, I do have a question that I want to pose, because I don't think I ever had the opportunity to really ask you this question. As we are working towards anti-racism organizational change at the institution, and our first interaction together on a couple committees, but of course the Anti-Black Racism Task Force. And I just wanted to know, in terms of that experience, I'm trying to ask this question without really influencing your response or really putting my sort of opinion on it. But how do you feel that experience and the work, the great work that was done on that task force and bringing the issues to light, how do you feel that is really going to institute change at the University of Windsor in terms of anti-Black racism and other forms of racism and oppression at the institution?
I have so many thoughts. I don't know where to start. Is everybody okay with me just saying a bunch of thoughts, and then if people want to connect them, that's great. Make of it what you will. All right, cool. We have universal buy-in from the real life audience, so I'm going to go with that. All right, one, all task forces of this type in predominantly white institutions are super dangerous. Right? One, they reek of performativity. Right? Like it's a problem. Like it's a problem. We just did this, right, with an unnamed board at the municipal level. Example from 3 weeks ago. Okay, so now they are going to study themselves. So don't worry, everyone, and everyone can go back home and get off of Twitter. Because it is well in hand. We're going to study ourselves. This is one issue with task force. Right? We're studying ourselves. It's the president's task force. Right? That's extremely discomforting. Also, there's another paradigm. Right? I think that I'm riffing off of a comedian right now that makes me uncomfortable, but it's what I have in my head. The teenager. Hate you, Mom. What's for dinner? Once there's a task force, you got to participate. You got to participate. Because or else what you're saying is, no, someone else should do the hard work. No, you're asking for help, but I won't give it to you. Because I'd rather be here on the side criticizing when you mess everything up. That is actually a fine moral position for a 15-year-old. Like, it's fine. Is that who we want to be as moral adults? I'm not comfortable with that. I'm not comfortable with that at all. The particular endeavor of the Anti-Black Racism Task Force at the University of Windsor went, to my mind, borderline great, because it ended in the predominantly white institution saying, okay, we'll do every single thing that y'all said. I'm going to make the argument that's the only way that it can be. Usually these reports are the beginning of a conversation and negotiation in which the predominantly white institution that exerts power over the victimized and marginalized group then begins to negotiate about what they're willing to do to not be as terrible. I'm not gonna lie, that's what I was anticipating. Right? That's the story. That didn't happen in this case, but I have the feeling that that's part of the larger conversation about the institution and the way that it decided to go with it.
Yeah.
Now, here's a question. Did the way that that task force worked set that tone? I want your thoughts on that.
I think that the Anti-Black Racism Task Force, just because of the composition, the timing, people knew to stand up and take notice. People knew that the task force itself was going to hold the institution accountable, that this time around, you know, because there were 30 years of commissioned reports but before that, this time around, the institution was fully aware that what came out of this task force report needed eyes on it, needed attention to it with urgency, because there was no going back to the old ways of doing things. Because this group, I was going to use the term woke, but but yeah, but no, just in terms of, we just knew that there was no going back. The institution had to make the changes. There was no more sweeping things under the rug or letting time be of the essence in terms of, okay, well, if we give it enough time, the problem will go away. Absolutely, everyone was aware that was not going to happen this time around. And the seriousness with the task force approach, the work, the consultations, the questions, okay, this isn't just going to be surface level performative. No, it was a task force consisting of people who knew the right questions to ask, knew how to get things done. For instance, you coming in with a whole outline in terms of, it was a precursor to the Black Studies Institute and how we can go about hiring Black professors to the University of Windsor. So it was just a different dynamic. It was necessary, and you all brought it. You all brought it, and that's why we're working right now in terms of the implementation plan to actually implement those 41 recommendations, even though quite a bit from the task force report has already been implemented. Thank you very much to you and the team. But there's a lot more work to be had, and putting those accountability measures in place. So yeah, so that's what really the change was this time.
I know that there's questions. I don't want to go.
I know we could be here.
Can I say something about what you're saying though?
Yeah.
All right, cool. Miriam's speaking to something that's really real. Many things that are really real, but one thing that's really kind of in my head right now. Y'all, the amount of work. Those of you that know me, I will joke that I've been tired since I was 12, but like the last year, the amount of work, just labor. The core search committee for the Black Scholars Hiring Initiative is the vast majority of the existing Black faculty members at the University of Windsor. Some of you are here tonight, some of you are here tonight. I know that you see an email from me in your inbox and you cringe. I know that. There's so much work. And I'm even going to take it one step out from there. All of the members of the individual search committees that are made at the faculty and departmental level to make sure that we have dual representation, right, between building Black studies and building individual departments and faculties. That's a lot of work. The equity assessor that sits on all 14 of these searches, she's here tonight. I'm so sorry. Just the labor. Forget about your brilliance. Forget about how amazing you are. The amount of work that you do, all in here, is talk about intentionality, talk about best practices, talk about the way that we should be as moral people in the world. I don't want to invisibilize and I don't want to let slide what Miriam just said. Who has a spare 50 hours a week on top of their job? And the fact that that always falls disproportionately on feminized people, the fact that it always falls disproportionately on racialized people, and the fact that we're asking the very people that structurally have the least amount of time to do the work, I don't know how to get out of that.
What do you say? It's real. It's real. Thank you, Natalie. There's a couple questions in the chat. Yes? Sure. Yes, okay. All right. So we'll start with the first. Oh, I better get my glasses. First question in the Q&A, and then we'll go to live audience questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and Kayla will come to you. So we have friends that have posted in the chat. So thank you for your stimulating, impassioned, and inspiring talk, Dr. Delia Deckert. My question is, do you think that an entity like RACES that advocates from, that advocates from the inside and effectively holds the inside accountable could exist within other social institutions, or is it specific to structures of relatively free agents like scholars?
I want to speak to the Black table in the cafeteria and engage with the broadest possible like meta framework for that question. Where does solidarity come from? Where does a collective come from? Where does agency come from? I tell the story all the time, right? I was shocked. I came into new faculty orientation at the University of Windsor. It was the first time that I was working in a Canadian institution. And in US institutions, which I'm not positing are better or worse, but they are different. At occasions like this, all the racialized people sit together at one table. Like, it's obvious, right? And we don't all like each other or anything, but we're in it together. And what I do is going to reflect on you. And what you do is going to reflect on me. And there's no option there. Right? We're in it. Hey. I got there first. I sat right next to the only other racialized person that was already there. You could see on her face that she was a little surprised because, like, you know, when you like go into the subway to sit, you're supposed to like space yourself. And there were only like 5 people there, and there were like 70 seats, and I sat right next to her. And that seemed perfectly normal to me because where else am I going to sit? Hi. And then I saw another racialized person come in the room, and I was like, "It looked like she was looking around for a seat. Why is she looking around for a seat? We're here. You can sit." And then another racialized faculty member came in about 5 minutes late. So then at the break, I went up to her and I was like, "Why are you sitting on the other side of the room?" And she's like, "I don't understand the conversation we're having." And I was like, "I don't either. Like, why? You could sit with us." And she was like, "Oh, you want me to sit with you?" And I was like, where do collectives come from? What is optional and what is understood as threatening to the dominant power structure? The question was, could races exist in other types of institutions, and under what circumstances and how? Broadly read. Right. The second that there's a table, there's races. The second that we are not allowed to have a table, and I don't care if we're in an institution of higher learning, right, or any other type of entity or organization, the second that that is taken from us, then the siloing, the onlying, the disempowerment and the oppression and the exploitation and the abuse happen. I'm team collective. I always make the table. It's the way of socialist. And I'm not actually on my journey to change. The question is how do you make sure that there's that? That's the best answer that I can give. It's an excellent question. Thank you for it.
Sorry, very quickly, could you tell us what races is?
Oh, the question from the audience is, can you tell us what races is? The acronym has changed what it stands for, so this feels like a little bit like a pop quiz right now. I don't know what the acronym stands for anymore. I apologize. I used to know. RACES is an affinity group of racialized faculty members, staff, and students at the University of Windsor that meets in solidarity, not just to respond to individual and institutional acts of racism at or around the institution, but to provide support, make sure that there is commonality of information. Get me started on commonality of information and how important that is. Right? The entire idea of confidentiality is deeply white supremacist. I'm against it. And yeah, meet regularly to be that table. RACES is the table. And if anybody knows off the top of their head what it stands for, there's a number of RACES members in the group. Just hook me up.
Racialized academics, advocates, centering solidarity.
It's not great. It's not going great. Can you say that again so I can repeat it? Where do we land? Racialized? Racialized academics and advocates centering equity and solidarity. There it is, folks. Yay. That was really bad.
Okay, so our next question from the Q&A online. So Natalie, I commend and applaud your on-point and visionary critical roar founded in gratitude and growth. Breaking the constructed common sense coding in post-secondary institutions is a responsibility belonging to all. When not all are on board, the righting of the ship moves slower. Should we focus on the pace of movement or on the idea that there is movement?
What an amazing question. / comment, right? Because it's also, it's an interrogate. Yeah, thank you. I want to be clear that I speak now, as I always speak, from a particular positionality and socialization. I'm of Cuban descent. We are co-ethnic with the Dominicans, with the Puerto Ricans, right? We're Afro-Latinos. One could make the argument that the Puerto Rican national motto is pa'lante, which is Spanish slang for forward, for forward. You don't have to go home, but you cannot stay here. Do we have an unbelievably well thought out plan of where exactly this needs to go and how and what we're going to do when we get there? Rarely. But forward, gotta go. Perfection is the enemy of the good. Pa'lante. Do I care as a person from my particular socialization about the pace? Yeah, sooner's better than later. Pa'lante. Do I care that it be right? Yeah. Do I care that it be perfect? Do we make strategic compromises? What is the right way, pa'lante? Well, let's talk about it. Let's find some consensus and let's go. Gotta go. I recognize that when I say that, it's not just that I'm saying that in this context, right? Those of you that have sat with me in community know I say the same thing. Decision time, let's do this. What are the options? Where are we going? And I am talked down as often as people are willing to vote. And that's fine too, because we gotta go. That is my best answer to that excellent question. It's a great question. Thank you for it.
Any questions?
Hello, I'm Donovan.
Hello.
I want to ask a question based on Goffman's theory of front stage and backstage. And in my experience here, in the backstage, everyone said what's happening to me is horrible, terrible, blah, 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 blah. But when it came to the front stage, not a single person would say a single thing. How do we get past that barrier?
Donovan, what a great question. I should name anonymous participant. What a great question. I want to bring it into the sphere very clearly of oppression broadly writ. What do we do with the person that says one thing to our face and enacts systemic violence when we're not in the room? What do we do with the nice racists? Y'all know who I'm talking about. Oh my gosh. In real life, people almost never argue with me. I'm like, such and such is racist. They're like, oh yeah. Oh yeah. And then as soon as I leave, they're like, we're never listening to her. That's never going to happen. I know that. I know. How do we close that gap? Right? One of the nice things about operating in grace, one of the nice things about a 100% commitment to advocacy, one of the nice things about institutionalizing an anti-racist, anti-oppressive paradigm is that it forces accountability. About 6 months ago, so it's relatively recent, I started saying this thing where I was like, I don't proselytize, I don't convert, I don't need buy-in from your soul. I just need you to do the thing. I'm not actually trying to win anybody over at this point. I can't claim any of that. They recently announced there's 8 billion people on this planet. I don't know what people are doing. I like literally don't speak the languages of 90% of the world population. I know what's best for them and I'm going to tell them today. That's not true. But how do you make it so that there is accountability, so that there is visibility, so that there is transparency, and so that people have to do the thing? That's about what we discuss, or what I discussed in this presentation. I don't think that I've gotten it 100% of the way there, right? But we're at 80-20 Pareto. Right? If you have that, you have a running start. The problem is real. And the question is, how do you make it so that they can't? Right? Thank you for it. It's a great question.
Thank you. So we're going to go back to online for another question. I'm going to invite the one individual online who has their hand raised. If you are able to post your question in the Q&A as the mics out and cameras have been disabled, that would be great. And then we can address your question in that manner. Our next question from another friend. Thank you, Dr. Deckard. Does the work of eliminating racial discrimination at the public institution fall disproportionately to racialized people? If so, how to change? Is the work getting the funding and support it needs? How do we ensure that it does? Ooh, I can talk to that.
Mm-hmm.
That's for you.
Actually. Can I take the easy part and you take the hard part? Is that cool? This is when we saw in real life, Natalie, take the easy part. The answer is yes. So much yes. So much yes. You are actually speaking to the shell of a human being right now. Yes. The work of change falls disproportionately on racialized people. And I do not want to invisibilize the role of gender. On feminized, racialized people. Right. Also, for us, by us, y'all. I never know how to get around that. Those two things exist in direct contradiction to one another, and I believe them both to be true. I do not want a world in which white people figure out my life and fix it for me. I don't want that. I don't want that. And what that naturally means is that I would fix my life and all of the labor, that fixing the institutions that oppress me, that fixing the government systems that work to make sure I'm poorer, less educated, and live fewer years systematically. Change. I don't know how to thread that needle. No pressure.
Well, no, I will make a comment that my colleagues in the VP EDI office have heard me say time and time again. And let me look around the room. Is my boss here? No, but that's okay if he is, because he would concur. But I think it is a sentiment that really needs to be heard in spaces where people are doing the work of anti-racism, or are doing the work of equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization. And I've said time and time again that we are fitting the stereotype of being a department that is overly racialized, overly worked, and underfunded. And the fact that you've added in the gender dimension there as well, I mean, absolutely. So it's pretty much that in a nutshell for me. We are doing the work. It is exhausting work, but I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't want to do it. But that's not even the point. The point is it's exhausting. It's mentally draining, where you're working with individuals who want to be allies, who want to be co-conspirators, but then have the option to fall off. And if it gets too much for them, they can retreat to their corners if they want to. So I don't have that luxury, once again, because I'm doing the work because I want to do the work, but I need to keep going. But at the same time, I've reached the point where in doing the work and knowing that this work is important to post-secondary spaces, I have to be very protective of my time as well. So, I mean, there's so much more I can go on about that, but is there anything else you want to add to that?
Y'all, Miriam said the mental labor. Can we talk about emotional labor? Yeah, there's a lot of work, right? As evidenced by the number of words on pages and the number of pages, and that is work product. And last time I checked, that is like, if I worked at McDonald's, we would talk about the number of French fries, like it's work product. But also, it's having a fight all the time with everybody. It's exhausting. And then I come home, I have like a whole life, y'all. I'm like a 360-degree human being. And I'm like, you want to hear what he said? I'm going to tell you what he said. No one wanted to hear. But they have to. And that becomes my home life. That's not actually cool. That's way more, right, than can you put out another 5 pages today. Right? The emotional labor of trying to convince people that what they are doing is part of the problem. And I don't actually, like I said, I'm not trying to convert anybody. There's no market demand to enroll at a historically and notoriously racist institution. There's no market demand for it. That's what we had. Wasn't working. Now we have to do something different. I only read the news. Why do I have to hold your hand and beg you to help you? One nice thing, right, is Black Scholars Hiring Initiative. Now we do all the full search committees. Overwhelmingly, right, it is what would anti-racist work look like if everyone were actually down to move things forward. It's actually really easy. Let's not exaggerate. It's actually aguantable, tolerable. She said really easy. It's a totally different type of work than the very few meetings that at this point I go to, where people are honestly trying to be obstructive. Why? Get on the train. It's moving. Mental work. Right? And we can never unpack how much legitimacy, how much willingness people have to give buy-in, right? Depending on the embodiments of the person that they're supposed to buy into. Right? It is unbelievable to me. Right? How much, right? It's my opinion, my belief, my bias, right? Because I'm feminized and I'm not white. How dare I? And watching that transition, I'm not gonna lie, it's infuriating. Like, it's infuriating. I said that race was a function of time and place. I'm 5'2" tall. I grew up in New York and Miami. I am the average size woman, like cisgendered woman. Globally, the average cisgendered woman is 5'2½". I'm completely unremarkable. So I moved to Canada, now I'm short. And don't pretend there's not a hierarchy. There's a hierarchy. It comes up in conversation to delegitimate me all the time. I spent 38 years of my life being unremarkably sized. That wasn't part of the problem. Now, in addition to being this, I'm also small. There has to be another, right? The way that legitimacy is inextricably linked to the embodiment increases the amount of emotional labor, right? For the people who we know are already overburdened by labor. That to me, thank you for, I didn't think about it until you said it, right? That to me is key, right? You want to talk about ally? Ally is not a noun, it is a verb. If you are not in group, it is optional for you, period, end of story. Right? You want to talk about how to ally effectively? Just get out of the way. Make it easier, not harder. Yeah, that's it. Mental, emotional labor.
So I think, yes, I think we have time for one more question. I know the time's going by fast.
I'm not trying to name people on the thing, and I keep doing it accidentally.
Thank you very much for this talk. My question is, how do you send the message that being anti-racist is for everybody, not just the racialized people? Because when you're doing that work, you know, the non-racialized people, they tend to say, okay, we're going to allow you, we'll create a space for you. You can work within this space. And really, it takes all of us for it to be lasting. So how do you send that message? It is for all of us.
What a question to end. I'm so glad that you're here and you asked it. I can't think of a better, more poignant way to underline what all of the literature points to in terms of where one has to be in order to be anti-racist as an institution and fulfill a public mandate. The reality is that in a capitalist society, privilege is almost always zero-sum. I'm pausing on purpose. Right? We can talk about ways in which equity, right, fundamentally works to make the institution and the society a better place. Right? We are more innovative. Right? We are richer. We are less dumb. I'm saying that like on purpose, like less dumb. To, what is the proverb? To a person with only a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. That's dumb. There's lots of tools. You should use them. Diversity ultimately works for everyone. Right? And this is why we start talking about like the long arc. In the short term, equity feels like oppression to the privileged. That is also true. In the short term, the idea that we make claims on our own behalf, despite the fact that that is fundamentally immoral, is demonstrated reality. People do it if they can. In an absence of accountability, in an absence of transparency, in an absence of a table that holds feet to the fire and requires and demands and forces. I think I'm telling the story of organized labor right now. Those short-term feelings of loss, of disadvantage, wait, reverse racism would like a word, win out. And we saw that year after year at this institution, absolutely. People sought to maintain their own privilege at the expense of others over whom they had power. Your question gets to the heart of it. Right? How do we make it visible and keep it visible? That we need to be long-term thinkers, because or else we are dying slowly. The 4 slides where I talk through like what we've done and why, right, in terms of best practice, are all to speak to that. And I think we're on the right track, y'all. Thank you. What do you think?
No, I think we'll end it there. And on behalf of the Office of the Vice President, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, we want to thank Dr. Natalie Delia-Deckert for joining us this evening for this amazing talk. And well, there's lots of hands and clapping in the chat. And yes. Thank you. This was amazing. This was an amazing session, and I just want to go back to that point about movement, and I think that sort of propels us to the next conversation we need to have, because we want to keep these conversations going. And as you said, pretty much at the top of your presentation, you don't want to give the impression, I'm not giving the impression that we're there yet. We are far from being there yet. So we want to keep having these conversations about where we are, where we've been, where we're going, where we are at that particular point in time and how much further we need to go. So with that being said, thank you everyone for being here live and online as well. And please join us tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for our next session. Once again, if you need to sign up, please go to uwindsor.ca/VPEDI to sign up for tomorrow's sessions and for the remainder of the week. Thank you very much and have a great night, everyone.